I was still wearing my apron when my husband told me to apologize or get out. Not, "We need to talk." Not, "Let's step outside." He said it in front of his entire family, at a table covered in cranberry sauce and mashed potatoes, like I was a child who had knocked over a glass of milk. So I stood up, I smoothed my dress, and I said the word he wanted to hear. Okay. What he didn't know was that okay wasn't surrender. It was a countdown. By midnight, I had 2 suitcases packed, my son asleep in my arms, and 2 one-way tickets to a country he couldn't even find on a map. By morning, his family's phones wouldn't stop ringing because I had already sent the one thing they spent 6 years trying to bury. This is the story of how a bowl of stuffing ended a marriage, and how silence, once broken, doesn't just whisper. It screams. My name is Everly, and 3 years ago, I thought I had built a good life. I was 31, working as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm in Columbus, married to a man named Sawyer who used to make me laugh so hard I'd forget what we were even arguing about. We had a son, Finn, who was 3 years old and obsessed with dump trucks and dinosaurs in a way that made every grocery store trip take twice as long. On paper, everything looked stable. I made good money. Sawyer worked in sales, commission-based, which meant some months were flush and some months were tight. I didn't mind the unevenness. What I minded was the silence that came with it. The way Sawyer would change the subject whenever I asked about our savings account. The way he'd laugh off questions about a new watch or a new set of golf clubs he got a deal on. I told myself it was nothing. Every marriage has its blind spots. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact shape of my own denial. I was the one who balanced our budget every month, who set up the automatic transfers into savings, who tracked our expenses in a spreadsheet color-coded by category. When numbers came up short, Sawyer always had an explanation ready before I even finished asking the question. A client dinner that ran long. A slow commission month. A "we'll make it up next quarter" that never quite arrived. I wanted to believe him, so I did. That's the part one still have trouble forgiving myself for. Not the years I spent married to him, but the years I spent choosing comfort over asking the harder question twice. The real problem wasn't Sawyer, though. Not at first. It was his mother. Eleanor had never wanted me in the family. I found that out 3 weeks into dating Sawyer when she looked me up and down at a family barbecue and said, "So you're the one keeping him from finishing his degree." I hadn't even known he dropped out of college. She made sure I found out in front of 12 people. From that day forward, everything I did was wrong. If I worked late, I was neglecting my family. If I stayed home, I was lazy and living off her son. If I disciplined Finn, I was too harsh. If I let him have dessert before dinner, I was too soft. There was no version of me that Eleanor would have accepted, because the only acceptable version of me didn't exist. She was a woman who didn't exist, who deferred to Sawyer in everything and asked for nothing in return. Sawyer never defended me. Not once. He'd go quiet at family dinners, staring at his plate while his mother picked me apart, and afterward in the car he'd say, "That's just how she is. Don't let it get to you." What made it worse was how selective Eleanor's disapproval could be. She adored Isla, Cassius's wife, who had quit her job the year she got married and never worked outside the home again. Eleanor bragged about Isla to anyone who'd listen, how devoted she was, how she never put herself first. I used to wonder if Eleanor genuinely believed the things she said about family, or if she simply needed a version of womanhood she could hold up as proof that her own choices had been the right ones. Either way, I became the family's convenient contrast. The cautionary tale nobody asked to star in. I let it get to me for 3 years. Every Thanksgiving, we drove 2 hours to his parents' house in a quiet Ohio suburb, a place with a manicured lawn, a dining room with a chandelier too large for the space, and a display case in the hallway that held his father Roscoe's collection of antique hunting blades, polished and mounted like trophies nobody was allowed to touch. Every Thanksgiving, I told myself this year would be different. Every Thanksgiving, I was wrong. That year, Finn had just turned 3, old enough to run but not old enough to understand why he shouldn't touch the glass ornaments hanging low on Eleanor's Christmas tree, already up in late November because she liked to get ahead of the season. I spent most of the afternoon chasing him, out of the dining room, away from the hot oven door, away from his grandfather's display case, which nobody else seemed to think was strange to keep at toddler height. Sawyer's brother, Cassius, sat in the living room with a beer, watching football, occasionally glancing over like my parenting was a form of entertainment. His wife, Isla, sat beside him, scrolling her phone, offering nothing but the occasional comment about how some kids just need more structure. I said nothing. I smiled. I chased my son. I told myself, again, that this year would be different. By the time we sat down to eat, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the cooking or the cleaning. It was the exhaustion of holding my tongue for 6 years. Eleanor waited until everyone had a full plate. She always did. She liked an audience. "So, Everly," she said, that same pleasant smile that never once reached her eyes, "are you still sending Finn to daycare? I keep telling Sawyer, a little boy needs his mother, not strangers raising him." The table went quiet in that specific way tables go quiet when everyone already knows what's coming. I looked at Sawyer. I always looked at Sawyer first, some old habit of hoping he'd finally speak up. He kept his eyes on his plate. "I work because I need to," I said, keeping my voice level. "And because I want to." Eleanor let out a small laugh, the kind designed to sound sympathetic while doing the opposite. "Of course you do. You always put yourself first." Cassius smirked into his drink. Isla leaned toward her teenage daughter and whispered something that made the girl giggle behind her hand. Heat crept up my neck. I felt it the way you feel a storm coming, pressure before the rain. "I pay half the mortgage," I said. "I pay for Finn's daycare. Last year, I paid off $4,000 of Sawyer's credit card debt without a single complaint." Sawyer's fork hit his plate hard enough that the sound cut through the room. "Everly," he said. A warning. Eleanor leaned forward like she'd been waiting for exactly this. "There it is. Always keeping score. No wonder my son looks miserable." Something in me, some final, worn-down thread gave out. "No," I said, and my voice shook, but I didn't stop. "Sawyer looks miserable because he spent years lying to this entire family and letting me clean up after him." The room went still. Sawyer's head snapped up. "What did you just say?" Eleanor's voice had lost its sweetness entirely. I stood. My chair scraped against the hardwood, loud in the sudden silence. "Ask him why our savings account has less than $300 in it," I said. "Ask him why he borrowed $10,000 from my father 2 years ago and never paid it back. Ask him why he tells me every month that we're struggling, while he's been quietly moving money into a trading account and losing most of it." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Sawyer stood so fast his chair nearly tipped. "That's enough." "No," I said. "It's not enough. I've spent 3 years letting your family blame me for problems you created. I'm done." His jaw tightened. And then, in front of his mother, his father, his brother's wife, and his niece, he said the words that would end everything. "Apologize, or pack your things and leave." Every eye in that room turned to me. I could feel what they expected. Tears, an apology, the same surrender I'd offered 100 times before. Instead, I looked past all of them, toward the living room, where Finn had fallen asleep on the couch with his toy dump truck still tucked under one arm, completely unaware that his entire world was about to change. And the anger I'd been carrying just left. What replaced it wasn't sadness. It was clarity, sharp and cold and absolutely certain. "Okay," I said. Sawyer stayed behind that night. He told me he needed to clear his head, which I understood, even then, to mean he needed his mother to tell him he'd done the right thing. I drove home alone with Finn asleep in his car seat, and somewhere on that dark highway I stopped crying. I stopped shaking. What took its place was a plan, not one I built that night, but one I realized, driving home, I had already been building for months without letting myself admit it. Because here's what I hadn't told anyone at that table. For the past 4 months, I hadn't just been suspicious of Sawyer's finances. I'd been documenting them. It started small. A missing $400 from our joint account that Sawyer explained away as a work expense reimbursement pending. Then $600 more then a full paycheck that never showed up where it should have. I'm a financial analyst. Numbers don't lie to me the way people do. So I started pulling statements, screenshots, transaction histories. I opened a folder on my laptop labeled, blandly, tax documents, because I knew Sawyer would never look there. What I found over those 4 months made my stomach turn. Sawyer hadn't just borrowed $10,000 from my father and failed to repay it. He told my father the money was for a home repair, then used most of it for a high-risk options trading account that lost nearly 70% of its value within 3 months. He'd taken out a personal loan in both our names, a loan I never signed for, using a signature that I later confirmed, with the help of a document examiner, was forged. He'd missed 2 mortgage payments that he told me he'd handled, catching them current only after late fees had already been quietly paid from an account I didn't know existed. And the recordings. I want to be honest about this part, because it matters. Ohio is a one-party consent state, which means it's legal to record a conversation you're a participant in without telling the other person. I had started keeping a small recorder in my bag months earlier, not out of some grand scheme, but because I'd learned that after family dinners, Sawyer would sometimes tell me one version of events and later insist he'd said something else entirely. I wanted proof of my own reality. I never imagined that proof would end up being the thing that changed everything. That night's dinner was on the recorder, too. Every word. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I wasn't a woman fleeing a bad night. I was a woman who had just been handed the final piece of evidence she needed. I packed 2 suitcases. I gathered Finn's passport, my own documents, and the emergency cash my grandmother had pressed into my hand years earlier, along with words I never forgot. Every woman should have a way out, even if she never plans to use it. Then I opened my laptop and booked 2 one-way tickets to Lisbon, Portugal, a city I'd visited once for a work conference and quietly fallen in love with, and a place Sawyer had 0 ties to, 0 contacts, and 0 ability to reach without a passport he didn't have ready. By the time Sawyer and his family realized Finn and I were gone, we were already 30,000 feet over the Atlantic. I want to be clear about something. I didn't leave the country to hide. I left to protect my son and to give myself the distance to do what needed to be done without interference, without Eleanor showing up at my door, without Sawyer trying to talk me out of what I already knew was right. Before we boarded, I sent one final email, not to Sawyer, but to my attorney, a woman named Margot Holt who I'd hired quietly 2 months earlier after the forged loan document surfaced. Attached to that email was everything. The recording from Thanksgiving dinner, 4 months of bank statements, the forged signature analysis, the trading account records, and a fully drafted divorce petition citing financial deception and forged documents. My attorney filed the petition the next morning. Within 48 hours, 3 things happened at once. First, the bank flagged the forged personal loan for review after my attorney submitted the signature analysis, which meant Sawyer suddenly had a bank fraud investigation attached to his name, one he couldn't blame on me because I had the paperwork proving I never signed it. Second, my father, who had never been repaid that $10,000, received a call from my attorney's office and, for the first time, learned the money he'd handed over for a home repair had actually funded a trading account that lost most of its value in weeks. My father is a quiet man, but quiet men remember everything. I still remember the silence on the phone when I explained it to him myself, before the lawyers got involved, the long pause, and then his only question. Does Everly know how much of her college fund we used to help them with the down payment on their house? I hadn't known that either. It turned out Sawyer's debts had been quietly absorbing pieces of my own family's generosity for years, and nobody had thought to tell me. My father didn't file criminal charges right away, but he made it clear through his own lawyer that repayment, with interest, was no longer optional, and that any further misunderstanding would end differently. Third, and this is the part that made phones start ringing across an entire family tree, I sent Eleanor a single email. Not angry. Not dramatic, just factual, with the Thanksgiving recording attached, along with a note that read, "You asked why Sawyer looks miserable. Now you know." Eleanor called me 11 times in 1 hour. I was somewhere over international waters for most of them, phone and airplane mode. my son asleep against my shoulder, utterly unaware that his father's carefully built version of reality was collapsing in real time. Here's where the story takes a turn I didn't see coming, even after everything. 2 weeks after we landed in Lisbon, my attorney called with an update. In reviewing the forged loan documents as part of the fraud investigation, the bank's internal team had flagged something unusual, a pattern of small, structured transfers moving out of Sawyer's personal trading account and into an account belonging to his father, Roscoe. At first, I assumed it was simple financial support, a father helping a struggling son. But the transfers had started nearly 2 years earlier, long before Sawyer's trading losses began. When my attorney dug further, working with a forensic accountant, a different picture emerged. Roscoe hadn't just been receiving money from Sawyer. He'd been the one who originally introduced Sawyer to the high-risk trading platform, and he'd been quietly steering a portion of both their retirement savings into it for over 3 years. Money that, according to Eleanor's own later statements to my attorney during a deposition, she had no idea existed. The family home, Eleanor was so proud of, had a second mortgage on it that Sawyer's father had taken out without her knowledge, using some of that money to cover trading losses that had nearly wiped out what Sawyer and Roscoe both owed. In other words, the man with the display case full of polished antiques, the patriarch who sat at the head of every Thanksgiving table judging my choices, had spent years hiding financial decisions from his own wife, decisions that eventually pulled his son into the same pattern of secrecy and debt. Eleanor, the woman who once told me a good wife should never question her husband's decisions, found out at 61 years old that she'd been living that exact life without knowing it. I won't pretend I felt sympathy in that moment. I felt something closer to recognition. The family that spent 3 years telling me I wasn't good enough had been quietly falling apart from the inside, and it took an outsider, the woman they never accepted, to force the truth into daylight. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. Ohio courts don't move quickly, but forged financial documents have a way of speeding things along once a judge sees them. Sawyer was ordered to repay my father in full, with interest, over a 3-year structured payment plan enforced by the court. The forged loan was voided entirely, and the bank pursued its own investigation separately, resulting in Sawyer facing formal fraud charges tied to the falsified signature, charges that, as of the last update from my attorney, were still moving through the system. I was awarded full custody of Finn, with supervised, limited visitation for Sawyer pending the outcome of his legal situation. The court reviewed the Thanksgiving recording as part of the broader pattern of financial control and deception, and while it wasn't the deciding factor legally, my attorney told me privately that it painted a picture the judge didn't forget. I never spoke to Eleanor again after that email. I heard, secondhand, through a cousin who still checks in occasionally, that she and Roscoe separated within the year, unable to recover from the discovery that their entire financial life had been built on decisions made behind each other's backs. Cassius and Isla, for their part, went quiet. No apology, no acknowledgement, just silence, the same silence I'd offered them for 3 years, finally returned. I heard, months later, that Isla had quietly reached out to a mutual friend asking how I'd managed the move overseas so quickly, as though she, too, had been keeping a version of that plan tucked away somewhere, waiting for a reason brave enough to use it. As for me, I stayed in Lisbon longer than I originally planned. Finn started at a small international preschool built around a courtyard with an old fig tree in the center, and within a few months he was saying obrigado more naturally than he said his own last name. I kept my job remotely for the first year, waking up early to match Ohio hours, working from a small kitchen table with a view of terracotta rooftops instead of a cul-de-sac. Eventually, I transitioned to a position with a firm that let me build a life on my own terms, in a city that never once made me feel like I had to shrink myself to be accepted at a dinner table. There's a particular kind of quiet I found there that I hadn't known I was missing, not the tense, holding your breath quiet of Eleanor's dining room, but an easy quiet. Finn asleep down the hall. No one waiting for me to say the wrong thing so they could pounce on it. Just the sound of a city that didn't know or care about the woman I used to be at that Thanksgiving table and had no interest in making me smaller than I was. I think about that Thanksgiving table sometimes. The chandelier too big for the room, the display case nobody questioned, the silence I mistook for peace for far too long. I think about the exact moment Sawyer told me to apologize or leave, genuinely believing I'd choose the first option, because I always had before. He was wrong, and that single miscalculation cost him everything he thought he'd protected by staying quiet for all those years. Looking back, I don't think Sawyer ever understood what he was actually asking me to do that night. He thought he was giving me an ultimatum. What he was really doing was giving me permission to stop